Welcome to Building the Future. I'm your host, Kevin Horick. The radio and TV version of the show air in over 12 states. This includes both coasts and Silicon Valley. The show also airs in the UK, Caribbean, and Australia. For full show times, plus past episodes of the TV and radio show, please visit buildingthefutureshow.com. We just launched a free online community to connect past guests, listeners, and others. This community will allow you to network, chat on Slack, or get help with anything else, and a lot more. If you're interested in joining the community, buying some merch, sponsoring the show, or signing up for the newsletter, please go to buildingthefutureshow.com. The show is a proud media partner for the 11th Annual Media Excellence Awards, which are produced by Access Entertainment in Los Angeles, California. The Media Excellence Awards are recognized as the most influential awards show honoring innovation and leadership in all things mobile entertainment, lifestyle, and technology. For more information on how to submit to these awards, please visit mediaxawards.com. Welcome back to the show. Today we have Bryan Tuk. He's an attorney, author, and musician. Bryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Kevin. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show. I think, obviously, what you've written about is very relevant to the audience. Being an attorney, I think, no matter where you kind of go in life, understanding kind of the law is always beneficial, especially in kind of the startup entrepreneurial ecosystem. And, obviously I think also I've known a lot of people that seem to be in the space that are either were musicians, are musicians, want to be kind of musicians. So it's interesting to me that you kind of have three of the things that I think a lot of people in the space, have or want to have. But maybe before we get into all that fun stuff, let's get to know you a little bit better and start off with where you grew up.
Sure. I grew up in the suburbs around Philadelphia. So,
Okay.
Bucks County, which is, bordered by the Delaware River on the east, and then New Jersey's right on the other side.
Okay.
I'd say about 30 minutes north of Philadelphia.
Okay. Very cool. So you went to university. What did you take and why?
I went to a state school in Pennsylvania called Westchester University.
Okay.
Which is really a teacher's college. A lot of public high school and elementary ed teachers in this region went through that program. And initially, that's what I was going to be. I was going to be a music teacher.
Oh, interesting.
And I was a music ed major for a couple of years, and wasn't, midstream, I wasn't 100%, committed to that career path, and decided to change my major to business management and finished out that way.
Okay. And then walk me through kind of why you decided to go into law.
Well, I love a challenge.
Okay.
And really, I had worked in an insurance company. It was the classic Mike Judge office space environment with the gray cubicles and the big open space, and really a lot of people avoiding, working. Really
Okay.
What that I won't name the company, but
Sure.
it is one that everybody in the United States has heard of.
Okay.
And I mean, that movie is so true to life. It is startling, but that's a story for another time, probably.
Sure.
So I did that for a couple of years post-grad, and then a friend of mine, I noticed on her desk she had a prep book for the LSATs, for the law school admissions test.
Okay.
And I started leafing through it, and for some reason, I tend to be good at taking standardized tests. I don't know why.
Okay. Interesting.
That is, some people can run a 5-minute mile. I can run maybe a 15-minute mile because I'm a mess. But standardized tests, I can.
Interesting.
For some reason, I'm just wired that way.
Okay.
So I started looking through the book, and it just got my wheels turning because I had never even conceived of going into law. My father was an attorney.
Okay.
And he worked for the U.S. government doing labor and employment law.
Okay.
And it really, I don't think it was to follow in anyone's footsteps necessarily, but I was, young and unattached and ready for a challenge, and one thing led to another, and I found myself at Temple University School of Law in Philly.
Interesting. So maybe walk us through your career, maybe some career highlights up until kind of the stuff you're doing now.
Sure. Well, I practiced privately going into year 19 already, which is hard to believe. It does go by quickly.
Sure.
And I've always worked in suburban law firms. So I've represented businesses in every industry, and sometimes it's employment law issues. Sometimes they are issues of capital formation and fundraising.
Sure.
So some securities registrations and those kinds of things. And all the while, I had this very, at my core, I'm really an arts person.
Sure.
And enjoy going to museums and concerts and performing and recording and helping other artists if they need, another set of ears to listen to something or, to weigh in on something. And that's really kind of who I am at my core.
Sure.
But in the, at least in my experience, and I have found that this is a common thing in the what I would call the white collar world. So if you work in finance or
Sure.
law or accounting or something like that, where that is not always, or didn't used to be, a trait that was valued.
Okay.
You kind of were looked at like you were a hippie or you were, you were not.
Sure.
Because you weren't working on, your golf game, or you weren't, doing whatever the ordained activities were of the white collar
Interesting.
world.
Sure.
I struggled against that a long time because I never talked about, if I was in a band at the time, I never talked about it at work. I never invited anybody to come see me play. And this led to a TEDx talk that I gave in 2014 about this, sort of having this breakthrough psychologically of, all these expectations that get put on you
Sure.
when you're young, starting out, are really the expectations of others.
Sure.
And once you kind of own, this sounds very touchy-feely, but I'll send you the link to the talk. It's
Sure.
It's much more streamlined than what I'm about to say. But once you start owning what you are at your core,
Mm-hmm.
you become vastly more effective, and opportunities start presenting themselves to you, whether you're ready for them or not.
Yeah, it's a really good way to put it. Interesting. Keep going. Sorry.
Not to sound too kind of like new agey about it, but I think when you realize that your uniqueness is a strength and not a weakness,
totally,
it completely changes your worldview. And as a result of that, people become attracted to you. Maybe they want to work with you because you're, maybe you're a great painter, or you do, whatever, photography or something like that outside of the office. All of a sudden, people get curious about that. And
sure.
Once I delivered that TEDx talk, I was just in my circle, in my sphere of influence, however
Sure.
small or big that might be. I started getting just people would talk to me, and these were like CPAs that I had known professionally for maybe 5 or 10 years.
Sure.
And they would go, "Hey, I was in a band when I was in college.
Sure.
And I still play. And I never never knew these things about these people, and it built like a real connection.
That's great,
So,
man.
it's not, we would, before the talk, the interaction would be something like you see them at a Chamber of Commerce event,
Yeah.
and you go, well, boy, the president really knocked it out of the park on that speech last night, or something like that, right?
Sure.
And there'd be some superficial exchange, and then you go, hey, call me if I can be of service, hey, call me. So that was before, and then afterwards, the interaction would be like, oh, I just bought this record. These guys really remind me of the Rolling Stones. You should check this out. And
Sure.
then we would start exchanging, bands we like or whatever, and then that would open the door to business. So it really, up until I reached that point, and everybody reaches that point at different times, I think, work was a struggle. I hated that. Sunday would roll around, and, you feel tense, you feel agitated, and your family members are like, oh, well, it's Sunday. Like people around you start realizing that there's workplace stress.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
it bleeds over into your home, and it bleeds over into your home life.
Yep.
And it affects those relationships. So I think, being comfortable, or, not everybody can be totally happy and thrilled every day of their work life. Of
Sure.
course, that's
Yep.
not the way life is. But if you are comfortable with yourself in your workplace, it is not as bad. And if you make the leap to start your own business, then it stops feeling like work altogether.
Interesting.
And you find yourself answering emails on Sunday and
Yeah.
thinking about, okay, what do I have to prep for? Where do I need to be? And then it's a totally different energy. It's a totally different animal.
Sure. No, I agree. I want to step back for a second, though, because I think it's really important to cover. You're a drummer, correct?
Yes.
So how did you kind of get into playing drums growing up?
That's a good question. I was probably like 10 years old.
Okay.
Or so. And whenever I would have pencils or rulers, like anything that was kind of like a drumstick in my hands,
Sure.
they were always moving. And how some people, this might be an odd analogy, but the relief that some people will tell you they feel when they smoke.
Okay.
Or if they are smokers and have stopped and they need to have something in their hand because it relaxes them. Well, for me, the feeling of moving sticks against a practice pad or a drum has that effect.
Sure.
I'm not saying it's an addiction, but I just think psychologically, I'm again probably the way I'm wired somehow.
Yeah.
It just was a thing that was an outlet and was relaxing. So I would, in the house I grew up in, when my older sisters and brother had moved out, there was a room for a drum set. So when I was younger, I'd play along with records, and I'd be up there. That was what I was doing. I wasn't really deliberately practicing anything specific. I was just like, oh, well, here's a song I like. And 2 hours later, it's time for dinner or whatever. So, but it's something I've always done, and I could not stop now. I don't think if I wanted to. I have a group of about 14 musicians around me that we play in different configurations.
That's
depending
awesome.
Depending on the job. So sometimes it's a trio, sometimes it's the full kind of like what we call the Full Metal Jacket version of the band, which
Sure.
is a five piece horn section.
Wow.
And four in the rhythm section, and scheduling and logistics are a bear for sure. But
Sure.
But it's great because I really believe in experience.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is I can, when, there's MP3s and music is very available. It's overly available on the computer and on your smartphones, but there is no substitute for going to hear a great
Totally.
live band
Totally.
and have those instruments move the air around you.
Totally. Even if you don't like the genre of music, I find it still can be like really great.
Yeah, I've heard, we've stopped calling ourselves jazz musicians because it's the smallest category of interest. When you see these marketing surveys, it's like 2.5% of the population likes that style. But I found that when we can get people in front of us and the band's, in that zone where everybody's just on fire and everything's clicking and everybody's playing well, those people who didn't know or thought they didn't like it, love it.
Sure. No, I 100% agree. Go ahead. Sorry.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, totally. I think part of the problem is like you get categorized a type of music, and if you heard like one song one time in that category and that you associate kind of everything in that category with it, but you're like, there's so many different varieties of it, and at the end of the day, it's just kind of music. You either love it or hate it, and I think a lot of people like stuff in almost every category. It's just they don't really even think about it, right? They just listen to it. But I think, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I think labels are troublesome at times, and I realize people need, a way to process.
Yeah.
It, sort of at a very, very general level. Am I likely to enjoy this or not?
Sure.
Am I going to go listen to, some Swedish death metal band? Probably not.
Sure.
I'm glad I know that's what they call themselves.
Sure.
But at the same time, there's probably one or two that are doing that I might find really interesting.
Yeah.
And once I start drilling down into that material, it's a totally different thing than I expected. So
sure.
Labels can be a double-edged sword.
Totally. No, and why I bring it up is because I think like you're an accomplished kind of musician. You run a kind of local jazz festival. You're also a member of kind of the Recording Academy, or a voting member, I should say, the Recording Academy, the Grammys. So obviously, like, what we're kind of about to talk about, I think is very kind of relevant to, obviously from the legal side, from the creative side, makes a lot of sense. But you wrote a book. What's it called, and why did you write it?
The book is called Risk, Create, Change, a survival guide for startups and creators.
Okay.
And the reason I wrote it was that I had, for a period of years, had several false starts with writing projects.
Okay. Why was that?
Maybe just psychologically I wasn't ready, or time or energy, or I wasn't able to commit the amount of time that was required to do it right. And, while that was happening, in my practice, my law practice, which I started shifting after my TEDx talk, I really started shifting over to representing creators a lot more.
Okay.
So I was around more photographers. I was around more filmmakers.
Interesting.
Some theater companies, etc. And I started seeing some common threads.
Okay.
Of just common questions that, regardless of what industry people were in, whether they were creators or whether they were a small tech company that had, an app or project that they needed capitalized, they all had sort of the basic same questions. So in the first version of this book, and I already have a list of things I need to add for edition 2, but the edition of the book I put out are those sort of top 8 or 9 issues.
Okay.
and a chapter on each. So the book's really sort of made to be a desk reference. You can read it out of order. All the chapters are self-contained. So if you want to think about how should I organize my business? Something very basic that everybody thinks about at the beginning.
Sure.
There's a chapter on that, and
Okay.
you can dive into that. And in 10 or 12 pages, it's not meant to be an exhaustive, a treatise on every arcane, rule and case. What it's designed to do is for startups and small business people that only have 10 or 20 minutes to focus on something.
Gotcha.
They can get in and out of that chapter and know what they need to know in order to spot issues. And I think from a small business perspective, the most dangerous place to be is not knowing what you don't know.
Yep.
If you follow.
Totally. I 100% agree with you.
So if you at least you have context for, hey, I think I need to call an accountant about this, and I'm fairly sure there's something I have to do with the state. Let me call my attorney.
Sure.
Then you're in good shape, because then you can connect with your professionals and get whatever it is addressed. So the entire book is not about law. It's really about sort of getting from square one to viability. And I think viability is, the best goal you can help people achieve, because once a business becomes viable, then you can scale it.
Sure.
But I think a lot of people fall into a trap where there are a lot of people on YouTube that are, I don't want to say self-appointed experts, but if a quick scan around social media, and you will find lots of people telling you, well, you should do this or you should do that, and you can make 7 figures.
Yep.
I find that a much more practical approach is beneficial. And one of the things I talk about with my startup clients is, what do you need to live? Like,
Sure.
if you're in an accounting job, I don't know why I'm picking on accountants. Sorry, guys. If you're in an accounting job that you can't stand, that's causing distress, like that Sunday night syndrome that we
Sure.
talked about. But you could build a viable business doing something that you're really, really passionate about. Let's figure out a way to do that, because there are now more tools than ever to help small business people get from that zero to viability. And what I mean by that is there are bookkeeping services that you can book you can hire on an as needed basis. There's legal help online. You don't need you don't need a high cost attorney.
Sure.
For some things. And I routinely talk myself out of work, because if I'm selling you something you don't really need, you're going to resent that. And I would not, and it's a breach of my duty to people, I think,
Sure.
to do that. So if there's something that, they can do on their own, I'll say, like they need a tax ID number or something like that. I'll say, here's the IRS website. It's meant for you to do yourself. You don't need me. I can do it. And
Sure.
if you're too busy, I'll take it. Sure. But
You give them the option at least, right?
yeah,
Okay,
totally.
interesting.
Absolutely. I think that's important. But, people start looking at, well, what do I need to live? Is it $50,000 a year? Is it 75? Is it 100?
Sure.
And if you can figure that out and deal with driving down expenses,
Yep.
I would argue that person, that hypothetical person we talked about,
Yeah.
is better off mentally and psychologically and everything else in a job at $60,000 a year,
Yeah.
working for themselves,
Yeah.
versus $100,000 a year, working for the man,
Yeah.
as it were.
No, it's good advice.
I think that if there were more people that did that, we would all be better off.
No, I 100% agree.
So,
I think the interesting thing that I've been thinking a lot about lately is almost to your point, is so many people think that when they're building a startup, that it needs to be this like $1 million, $1 billion kind of idea. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with making 50, 60, 100, 200 plus $1,000 a year, even part-time. If you made like an extra 30 grand a year part-time and it took an extra maybe like 5 or 10 hours a week, why is that bad? That's a successful startup, right? Like, I don't understand why,
Totally.
you know, like you're not a failure if you're making tens of thousands of dollars a year doing it part-time. You're also not a failure if you're making 50 grand a year, you're happy and you're running your own business. Like, that's not bad.
Don't get me wrong. I want people to prosper, and if they
Sure.
build a better mousetrap and can sell 20 million units of it, then God bless them. Like, that's
Sure.
phenomenal. But I think growing up in the 80s, I know I'm dating myself a little bit,
It's all good.
where there was, or it seems to me in retrospect, there was a very strong focus on materialism
Totally.
starting in that decade as a reaction, to the 60s, and then 70s there was an economic crisis in the U.S., and then in the 80s, mid-80s, as the U.S. came out of that recession, everything, again, this is just my opinion, but it seems to me that materialism really took a front and center
Totally.
space in people's minds. So
Yep.
they started to think, well, if I can drive a BMW 3 Series, or if I can join a country club, or I can do these other things, then that means something.
Yep.
In my travels with my legal clients that, have gone through some serious family upheaval, whether it's divorce or
Sure.
whatever, more often than not, the wheels come off. And again, I don't have a massive sample size. This is just my take on it.
Sure.
But
Yep.
more often than not, the wheels come off of relationships after achieving a major goal like that.
Yeah.
So I've had more people that I know who, and it's not just lawyers, it's other people in other industries too,
Sure.
where they thought, once I get this promotion,
Yep.
everything's going to be great.
Yep.
And you're really just masking some underlying issues that you married the wrong person or whatever's going on that might be irreparable.
Sure.
And when they achieve that degree of success, the shock of the wheels falling off of their personal lives is even more devastating because they had misplaced their trust. So back to the point of, what's a viable business and how can I live comfortably? Everybody's got some number
Yep.
that would vastly change the quality of their life. Now, that could mean you develop a part-time business, let's say it's photography, and let's say you shoot weddings on the side from your day job, and
Yep.
from that photography business you generate $35,000 a year,
Yep.
which in that industry is not hard to do.
Nope.
Wedding photographers are compensated very well.
Yep.
Well, that additional $35,000 in income, it might mean the difference between vacationing wherever you want to and not, or whatever, whatever the change is. And my point is that the number that would do that in people's lives generally is much smaller than they think.
Sure. Yeah. No, I 100% agree.
So if people are trying to go out and, to use a baseball analogy, trying to hit home runs every time, where they are better off just getting on base, just, hit a single, take a walk, get on base, and then do that a lot. And if you can do that a lot, the overall quality of life increases quite a bit.
Yeah. No, I 100% agree. I think the other thing that took me a long time to really realize, and it's not always the case, and it really depends kind of geographically, I find sometimes, but majority of the wealthy people that I've known that are like truly actually have money don't drive expensive cars, don't live in these crazy houses because they're not good investments. Majority of the people that I know that live in like fancy houses, fancy cars can barely afford to make the minimum payments on it. And I don't mean it mean, it's just you look up to these people and you're like, "Oh my God, like I want your house and I want your car." But if you like dive a bit deeper, it's like they barely make the payments, maybe they miss payments, or like they're sacrificing in other places where they can't travel because like they're house poor, right? And I'm not saying it in a mean way. It's just sometimes people idolize these material goods where, well, like I have one really wealthy friend, like it's insane the amount of money they have, and his dad drives a Suburban, right? Like he could afford anything on the planet. Like they have a plane, that kind of thing. Like they have their own private plane. And his dad drives a Suburban and his mom drives like a Ford SUV. Like, and it's just because that's just the reality of it, right? And it's interesting that we idolize these material things where you don't really know what it's truly like for that person that owns it. And I think just the stress of kind of money and keeping up with that lifestyle can actually end your relationship.
Absolutely right. I agree 100%. I think one of the greatest, and I am now going to sound like an anarchist, but
sure,
bear with me. One of the greatest, how should we say this? One of the greatest marketing campaigns that has done more harm than good in American culture is that home ownership is the American dream. Whoever came up with that should get some kind of award because I can't imagine another ideal that's more deeply ingrained in people. Once they get married, what's the first thing they do? They buy a house.
Yep.
Which is great. Now, if you're going to buying a house for cash, buying real estate is great.
Yep. Borrowing
money to buy real estate is where the deal turns sour.
Sure.
I think of another product, okay? Let's say we go to some store and there's two products on the shelf. One product is $10.
Yep.
And we can pay cash and we can buy that, whatever that thing is, we get it. And then product B, which is right next to it, is also $10, but we only have two. And the store goes, that's okay. We'll give you the $8. We'll spot you the $8.
Yep.
And you're going to pay us $16 for this thing that really is worth $10.
Sure.
So you're shoveling cash, and especially people that are in interest-only loans, which I suspect is a shockingly high number of people in the U.S., where you're just shoveling cash into the banking system.
Yep.
And not creating any real wealth for yourself. So you've got that dynamic happening. And then you've got this other dynamic where when residential, and commercial too, but when residential real estate is bought and sold, you're paying 6% commission on the sale price of the home for the most part. I mean, at least regionally here. Now, it's expressed as a percentage of the total price of the house. However, let's say we own a home. It was sold for $400,000. We had, 10% equity in it. We only had $40,000 equity in the thing. But the commission is $24,000.
Sure.
So expressed as a percentage of my net on the asset, over half of it's going to commission.
Sure.
And I'm lucky to get out of the transaction with zero, or sometimes you have to pay to leave, which it happens more often than people would think when there's people lose jobs or a family law situation happens where there's a divorce and real estate needs to be liquidated. So their home ownership as a concept is fine, but I think you really have to pick and choose your spots. And if you're like in my own case, for example, I choose to rent because I'm in my late 40s and I'm not 100% sure in 5 years, am I going to be in this town or am I going to be, maybe I'll live someplace else.
Sure. Yeah.
If I tie up all of our cash in a residential property, most of the net is going to get, most of the net you're going to build up over the next 5 years by paying the mortgage payments, that's not going to be that significant of a gain.
Yep.
And most of the gain is going to be erased by transactional costs anyway.
Yep.
So you'd never buy a stock. I mean, you'd never buy any other asset class with that kind of structure to it. It just doesn't make any sense. So I think people are starting to realize that, maybe it isn't the American dream. Maybe there's a better way to do things that will free you up to invest in other opportunities or to, just to not lose your shirt. I mean,
Sure.
every super wealthy person that I've ever worked for as an attorney, they all have one thing in common.
Okay.
And that thing is they are all private business owners.
Interesting.
If you have somebody that is a worker bee at a large corporation,
Yep.
unless they're at the top of the organization, that's different. But by and large, the rank and file American worker is not going to build wealth working for somebody else.
No.
So encouraging entrepreneurship and startups and new ventures, I think, is really the way to help people on an individual basis. And then sort of from a macro standpoint, I just think it's better for society when you have more people that are empowered and comfortable with themselves running around versus the opposite. You know what I mean?
Totally. I 100% agree. I think it's interesting. I also think too that a lot of generations just can't. The younger generations will never own a home. So like you're almost renting your entire life anyway. Sure, you have a mortgage and you're paying that to the bank, but if you're going to be paying that for the rest of your life, how is it really different than kind of renting? And it seems like a lot more people are kind of moving around, kind of not just the country, like the globe, right? So they don't want to be tied down, and they don't see it as like kind of a traditional thing that I think older generations were kind of like, I get married, buy a house, and that's just kind of like how society sees kind of the average life, right? Where I think nowadays people are like, I don't want to be tied down, and I want to travel, and I want to do this, and I maybe want to eat out more than live in a nice house, or maybe I want to just bike everywhere in this town and I don't even own a car, or I just want to take public transit, or both, or I want to just Uber around if I need a ride. And I read an article the other day that was saying in certain cities, just taking Uber made more sense and was way more cost effective when you take in car payments and insurance and parking, because parking's the big thing that kills you in certain cities, right? It was still cheaper by half or by 3/4 to just Uber when you needed it in certain cities around the globe, which I thought was quite interesting, right? So I think to your point about actually starting a company and kind of being your own boss, maybe you can make less money, but you're happier. It allows you to kind of travel more. You have more kind of freedom. But one thing I do want your thoughts on, we talked a bit about earlier, is kind of copyright. So, I start a business. Obviously, I don't want anybody to kind of rip me off. So how do you kind of see copyright these days? Because I think it's an extremely complex issue, especially if you're creating something and putting it online or kind of out into the world.
As the economy continues to transition from, heavy manufacturing more into the ideas and services space,
Sure.
intellectual property is the new gold rush, I think. Like
Interesting.
people in the 1800s would put, there was a massive rush on for hard assets, gold, silver,
Sure.
that kind of thing.
Yep.
Later on, it became real estate, and I think real estate's still a great opportunity in the right circumstance. That's the key.
Sure.
But intellectual property is something that people are realizing has tremendous value, and IP can be an audience, right? So everyone that's building a YouTube business right now, or an Instagram business,
Mm-hmm.
or any kind of thing like that, what they are really doing is they're building a brand.
Sure.
I'll subscribe to your YouTube channel because I think you have interesting things to say.
Sure.
And I want to, and somewhere along the way, I have made a judgment about your credibility or your wit or your, outlook on life or whatever it is. Now, from the creator standpoint, I'm not building anything. I'm maybe producing videos, so
Sure.
I'm creating something intangible because it only exists out in the air and on the web.
Yep.
But I'm deriving revenue from my ability to aggregate demand. So
Okay.
an advertiser will work with me if I can show them, well, my average piece of content gets 200,000 impressions or 1 million impressions.
Sure.
And I'm, the demographic is roughly looks like this, whatever the tools that YouTube gives you.
Yep.
And you have out of thin air created a business.
Yep.
And, I have a client who is still a minor, so I guess technically her parents are the client, but
Okay.
she has a YouTube business
Interesting.
and generates almost 6 figures, which at
Wow.
her age is astounding.
Well, for any age, really, from YouTube.
Yeah. Well, and the channel is, so because of confidentiality,
Yeah.
I cannot
Sure.
disclose my client names. But in any event, the YouTube channel is something that if I told you this 5 years ago, you would have laughed me out of the room.
Yep.
But the YouTube channel is an unboxing channel. So she'll go and buy products.
Mm-hmm.
She will bring them home. It is shot in her room. One camera. I mean, it's so simple.
Sure.
One camera, a couple of lights, a good microphone, and the production is not. It's polished, but it's not overly done. It's not. There's not some production company behind us.
Sure.
They do all this stuff themselves.
Interesting.
And she buys these products. She brings them home. She unboxes them. Could be clothing, could be makeup, could be shoes.
Yep.
And she gives a review of whatever the thing is.
Interesting.
If you had been at a Chamber of Commerce event 5 years ago and said, well, there's going to be kids building a business out of their house with little or no equipment and little or no organization, and it's going to be 6 figures, you would have been told you were nuts.
Yep.
But the importance of that is now in that person's situation, they have a brand. There's a logo,
Mm-hmm.
there's a name, there's a lot of what in the legal community you would call goodwill. There's goodwill associated with those intangible concepts. Now, unless you federally register the logo and, copyright the content and some other things, you really cannot stop anybody from taking your content and repurposing it.
Interesting.
So, registering your brand with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, it's not hard to do. It is a little bit lengthy, and that sometimes I will tell people, well, you probably should have an attorney for that because it'll save you time and money, ultimately.
Sure.
And copyright is also part of that. So if you are a songwriter or if you are an author, absolutely, if you're asking yourself, should I register this with the Copyright Office? If you're even asking that question, the answer is yes.
Interesting.
And
Okay.
here's why. The Copyright Act, the reason it's confusing is that it is a collection of older laws that over time has continued to evolve as Congress reacts to current events.
Got you.
So the original U.S. Copyright Act was written in 1909.
Yeah, well before the internet.
Pre-television. Right. I mean, there wasn't even,
yeah, fair enough.
Before radio
was
really adopted. So having that as your base, is interesting. I don't think that there's any will in Congress to do a global overhaul of the entire system, just because of how it would be like trying to throw out the U.S. tax code.
Sure.
And start over.
Sure.
There are too many vested interests, too many people make money off of the existing system to allow a wholesale change.
Sure.
But by federally registering your work, whether it's a trademark or a copyright, you get access to these federal statutes.
Okay.
Now, federal registration, and we'll just sort of focus on copyright.
Sure.
Gives you a lot of remedies that are not available to you under state law. So let's say I've published a book, but I do not protect it with the Copyright Office.
Okay.
If I see somebody using my material inside of Pennsylvania, I would have to resort to the state courts. Now, this is not a criticism, this is just mechanics. So the state of Pennsylvania does not have a robust copyright law that gives me the remedies that the federal law does. The federal law enables you to reach across state lines. So if somebody's doing something in Arizona, but I'm in Pennsylvania, I get access to the federal courts. The U.S. Marshal Service gives you nationwide service of process. If I was in state court, I would not be able to as easily begin a legal action against the infringer and get service and get all of the initial things that need to happen mechanically for a lawsuit to happen. But with the Federal Act, I can send a cease and desist letter to that person. And what the Copyright Act gives me is my actual damages. It gives me a statutory penalty between $750 to $30,000 per use. So if someone has published something 10 times, that's actually 10 infractions. Okay?
Interesting. Okay.
And then I get my attorney's fees on top of that. So the violation of the Copyright Act actually has very severe financial penalties attached to it. And for that reason, it's a good system. It is actually pro creator if you take the steps to enforce it. And I know that a lot of creators are not, there is a perception, let's say, that they don't have the funds to prosecute anything to protect their rights.
Interesting.
And that doesn't always need to be a hurdle. I mean, there are attorneys that I work on a contingent basis with these kinds of things, so they're not out of pocket to get started. And the deal is that whatever's recovered would be, I would get a percentage of it. So there are lots of attorneys that work on that basis.
Sure.
I think it's incumbent on creators to enforce their rights. Once you let something slide psychologically, the next time it becomes easier to dismiss, if somebody's doing something. But if I have a YouTube channel and I'm generating six figures or close to it, that's a business worth protecting. If somebody's infringing on my work, I'm going to take steps to stop them, because that's the same thing as if we had a store and somebody came in and loaded up their car with products and just walked out and didn't pay for it.
Sure.
So
it's interesting.
You got to think of it in those terms, I think.
No, that's fair. So you also have a podcast. What do you cover in the podcast, and what is it called?
The podcast is called Creator Confidential, and it was a way for me to just I just had an itch to do it, and it was kind of moving in the same direction as my law practice. So, I would interview, some Grammy-winning musicians and
Sure.
some arts and community leaders in my little part of the world here. And it's just a lot of fun to do. I think if you're a musician in particular, working, the technical aspects of working on it and microphone selection and
Sure.
placement and, EQing everything and getting it to sound good is actually an enjoyable experience. But, in part it was to, help tell stories
Sure.
that I thought would be beneficial to people. And really the thread that runs through all of the interviews is that the person being interviewed had a professional breakthrough that was somewhat non-conventional.
Interesting.
So even though the guests are from all different kind of sectors, that's the thread that unifies all the episodes. So it's I view it as sort of an adjunct to the law practice.
Sure.
In an odd kind of way, because it supports creativity and it's just I'm in year 2 of that now, I think.
Congrats, man. That's great.
Gonna work on a bunch of those episodes over the summer.
Sure. That's great. But Bryan, we're coming to the end of the show. So we covered a lot of stuff. So let's close with mentioning where people can get more information about you, the book, the podcast, and kind of any other links you want to mention.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, and again, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate your time.
Of course, man. Thank you for doing it.
And congratulations. By the way, the distribution of your show is not easily accomplished. I was on your website, and I'm like, wow, this guy's really doing it. This is great.
Appreciate it, man.
But you can. Oh, my pleasure. The book, you can learn. There's a blog that is associated with it, and if you go to riskcreatechange.com on the web, everything you need to know is right there, and it's available on Amazon in Kindle and paperback formats.
Sure.
And if you want to learn more about my, copyright and protecting your intellectual property, visit me at mycopyrightattorney.com. Can't be any easier. I try to boil
awesome.
everything down.
That's great, man. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be on the show, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks very much. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks, man. Me as well. All right. Bye.
Thanks for listening. To join the free community, buy some merch, sponsor the show, or sign up for the newsletter, please visit the website at buildingthefutureshow.com. The music for the show is done by Electric Mantra. You can check him out at electricmantra.com and keep building the future.